Hi there. In this video, we're going to look at the DockShell provider uh, Visual Studio project. And we're going to go through and show you how to configure it and kind of take you through each of the areas within the provider project itself. So provider projects are basically the points of extensibility for provides points of extensibility for your DockShell applications. DockShell, the framework, has a core set of libraries that are more or less built on MEF and look at for specific interfaces and named exports. A DockShell provider project gives you a whole bunch of defined named components, exports named with very specific interfaces being implemented. So if we look here, this is a DockShell provider project based on the Telerik third-party controls from Telerik. We open this up for the Visual Studio 2010 version of that. So there will be a provider project for Visual Studio 2010 and a provider project for Visual Studio 2012. I apologize. This is a Visual Studio 2012 provider project. And if we look at this, we see a number of solution folders, and this would be very much the same for each of the different provider projects that will be available, made available. So there will be a provider for developments and for DevExpress and for all of the major third-party controls that are out there. We'll eventually have supporting provider projects for those. If you look at this, there is a number of solution folders, and we'll just go through some of the more important ones to start with. So the default controls solution folder, as you can see, has a bunch of definition or components or controls that are wrappers for Telerik type controls. So for example, if we look here, we have this DockShell dock control. And if we open that up and we look at the XAML, what we will see is we will see that this is a RAD docking control. And if we go to the code behind for this particular component, you're going to start to see a very familiar pattern as we go through each one of these controls, in that they start with a bit of metadata, which allows you to put some definition that when you pull this into your application layout navigation model, you'll be able to kind of keep track and understand what you've changed if you have made any changes. And that's just a bit of extensibility around the metadata itself. You'll also see this tag here, which is a MEF tag. MEF is Managed Extensibility Framework. MEF is used in LightSwitch extensively. It's used in Visual Studio, and it is 100% leveraged within the DockShell framework. So when the DockShell framework is told to find a specific, in this case, interface that's iDockShell content container control, and by a specific export name, this is just a string constant, MEF does all the work of finding that control, whether it's in this assembly or it's in your LightSwitch application assemblies, client assemblies, or it's in some external assembly. MEF will go and discover that based on these tags that you define here. So they're very important that these are to be named uniquely. And subsequent videos, you'll see how you can take, for example, a view container and make a copy of it, and we show you how to kind of make these changes. The second attribute here is also it's MEF related, and that is, hey, when it's creating this particular component, do I create a shared, do I use a shared version of that component, or do I go ahead and create a non-shared version of it? For the most part, you'll probably always want to have non-shared. So the next thing is obviously the name of the class, and then that it supports the specific interface. You'll always see that there's a backing view model. The view models will be different depending on the type of control that's there. It will have different requirements around whatever the control's major requirements are. And this import attribute is also a MEF attribute. So basically what happens is that when MEF goes, so it starts with you defining the definition within the model, which then gets pushed into this into a bunch of partial classes that get compiled into your LightSwitch application. And then at runtime, the DockShell framework interprets what MEF components to pull together based on how you've laid it out in that model. And for example, if it's looking to instantiate a content container control, which is really where docking windows are situated, then it will go and it'll ask for it by specific export name and for components that support this specific interface or implement this specific interface. And as it does that, it says, oh, I see that there's an import, so it'll automatically go in and instantiate the underlying view model, in this case, that supports this specific interface. So that's basically how it's all wired together. And as you go through, each one of these core default controls, they all follow the same rules of engagement. So if you're looking at a view control, for example, so if we look at this, you can see that it is a rad pane, which is a specific type of window control within Telerik. And if you look at the back end code behind, you can see it's the exact same pattern with the metadata on top, the export tag, the string constant representing the default version of this particular view control, DockShell dock view control. The really cool part about DockShell, and specifically as a result of leveraging MEF, is that if you want to create another version of this, you simply keep the interfaces, but you make this a very unique string constant. You call it your own string constant, but very unique across your application wide. Rename this, and of course you're backing XAML. Make sure it matches up, and all of a sudden inside your when you go to your model itself, you'll see that as an option to pick or choose. And we do a lot of that in our subsequent videos, so I highly recommend that you watch those videos to kind of get a feel for how that's done. So we won't go through all these default controls, but you can see that there's an extensive array of sort of default behavior that DockShell will take advantage of if it's in fact defined within your provider project. There's other sort of default areas. So we have this in Telerik. We actually have something quite unique. It has a tile view control. A tile view control basically allows three types of state, like a minimum state, a maximum state, and a normal state or a restored state. And what we're doing here is we're saying, well, not only can you take a tile view and use it for containing content for screens, so min, max, and normal, or restored, which is what this layout allows you to do. But we also allow you to pivot, and instead of using a ribbon tab, you can use a tile view control as a primary form of navigation. So a good example of that would be a dashboard. And then, so in each scenario, we're providing the default definition of what that tile in that specific state would look like. And you have the complete freedom of making a copy of this and completely changing up how that looks on a as-need basis, or just taking the default version of that and using it. As we continue down the stack here, by the way, those are called view containers. You'll learn that view containers are where we inject LightSwitch screens. And we commonly refer to view containers as the Chrome. So it's the definition of the UI definition around the screen itself is what you're defining within these particular controls themselves. And there is a number of what we call layout controls. A layout control is like a window layout control for a docking framework. A single view layout control, which is basically like a modal or non-modal tool window that you can add. Another layout would be a embedded screen layout. So an embedded screen is basically you can sprinkle, if I can use that word loosely, a number of embedded screens within inside a view container. which are in fact LightSwitch screens themselves. So a good example of that would be a dashboard where the underlying view is actually a chart, let's say, coming from another LightSwitch screen. And you would simply use the embedded screen control to inject into a specific prism region that view, and you can have one or more LightSwitch screens automatically composing inside a single view. So that's what an embedded layout is. And of course, there's the tile view layout, which is actually in a specialized three-state or a multi-state layout control. So where you're using just strictly a one-to-one relationship, so embedded and single view and window layout controls, you're more than likely going to default to this default view container. And there's a great video that we've got that shows you how to customize this and create a custom view container, which starts with taking this one and making a copy of this and then modifying that copy. And in every scenario, again, you're going to see that same pattern as we look through. This is the single default view container. And if we go to the back end of this one, you can see that same pattern where the metadata on top, the export with the very specific hard-coded default string constant, supporting or implementing a specific named DockShell interface, and so on and so forth. So exact same pattern is established and followed for every element and control that is inside your provider projects, even right down to the actual command structures themselves. So for example, here we have a ribbon button. So it is based on a Telerik rad ribbon, and if we and you can see that there's some binding going on to the back-end view model, and if we look at the code behind for this particular command, you can see that it's exactly the same pattern of implementation. So if you wanted to create let's say a hyperlink command, you would basically start by taking a copy of this particular ribbon command, XAML and its code behind, and watch there's a great video, as I say, on the view containers. And if you get the view container, you'll get pretty much every other control that's here, or at least how to create your own or modify the existing default controls. Then there's a series of helper classes. We won't get into that too much. Region adapters, this is a fairly advanced area, but what region adapters do for you is since every control, well, let's put it this way, the framework that hosts the views has no idea of the specialty associated to each view. And it is these adapters within Prism that allow it to give this this very unique view the ability to kind of adapt into a non-unique environment. In Prism, that target area that you take and put controls into is called a region, or it's a region where you can target views into. So we treat every control, whether it's a push button or it's whether it's a tile view or a window, as we call that a view. And views are basically injected into regions, and regions are things that you can define yourself. There's a whole bunch of them that are defined automatically within each of these controls, and they basically represent points of extensibility where the actual views will be injected into at runtime. You can create your own regions and just come up with any old region name you want, and it now becomes this targetable point. Now, these region adapters are the adapters that basically allow these controls to come in seamlessly without having prior knowledge of what a backstage component does or what a DockShell control does. These adapters allow you to adapt, and that's really where the name adapter comes from. And another important area within your provider project are these services, these two services. And essentially, you don't really have to modify these, but to explain what they do, when you have different providers and they do they do somewhat the same thing, but they do it in very distinct ways. Sometimes you need a little bit of help to augment, the sort of behavior that you're looking to achieve from a specific control. So you might have one provider or one third-party control that does a really good job of say surfacing a modal window, and another one that doesn't. And these services basically provide control points which are called through by the framework to allow you to sort of achieve a very similar desirable behavior. There isn't a lot of code in here, and the good news is that you probably would never change this, but it's nice to know that you could if you wanted to. It's there to do so. The next thing is the shell folder, and this is in DockShell. This is the shell. This is the if we open this up, you can see here. This is the overall. We can see here that this is the overall container for our application itself, and this is what we refer to as the default shell. And again, if you look at the back-end code, you'll see exactly the same implementation characteristics as all the other controls. So if you wanted to create a custom shell, take a copy of this XAML and this code behind, and simply modify this string constant here to be a very unique name, and this to be a very unique class name, and go to town as far as how you want to lay out your XAML. Yeah, when we look at this particular piece of XAML for the shell, you can see, for instance, we've included this, and there's a rad ribbon control. But if you look down here, you'll see that there's this backstage definition in here. We just put that in for an example. You can take that out, or you can modify it to suit your needs. And as you go through this, you will see actually on that backstage control, we go down here. We want to go down a little further. We'll go down to here. You can see that we've got this embedded breadcrumb control, which is based on a rad breadcrumb control. And we've got a rad busy indicator. So basically you're building like a Silverlight shell that is highly extensible. And by using things like these region tags, you're providing points of injection, view injection, into your shells or into your controls that you're building. So for example, here we have a context menu. If you watch the introductory video, we actually build DockShell commands that actually are targeting this very specific region, this application context menu region. So highly recommend that you watch that video because it's very interesting in how that's all sort of wired together. So shells are very much like any other control. It is a view, and ironically, the starting point for this particular for DockShell, when in fact it doesn't have a provider project, is really nothing more than a simple grid. But as you add these additional components and these regions, you're basically providing building blocks for the views to be injected into at runtime. And you use the modeling tool to actually wire it all together the way you want to wire it together. So quite a bit of degree of flexibility. Speaking of flexibility, UI fragments. A UI fragment is basically any type of control that you want to compose into a composite piece of XAML that then you will, at modeling time, you will inject into various targeted regions within your application. So in our introductory video, we actually leverage these two examples here for a rad dropdown, and inside that rad dropdown we throw a context menu. And if you look at this particular piece of XAML, you will see that there is in fact a region in here that is in this case here, its name is actually coming from a backend viewModel property to give it a lot more flexibility. And yeah, so and if you look at the code behind for this, you'll find that it's exactly the same pattern, right? With the metadata, the export definition, and so on and so forth. So if you wanted to create another UI fragment, as long as you follow this pattern here and you implement the DockShell UI fragment, it will become something that you can discover in your modeling process as you're building out your model, and at runtime, and something that you can then point or link into a region within your application, and then at runtime DockShell will be able to discover that by simply asking MEF to go and find that specific export name that implements the DockShell UI fragment. And then finally we have the view models. So for pretty much all of the controls that are defined in your project, your default provider projects, you will have a backing view model. And the view models are there to support, unique functionality. So for example, if we look at the contextual control, so if we go back up to the default controls and we look at this particular DockShell contextual collection control, this provides contextual groups for ribbon tabs, and it's a specific control from Telerik. And you can see the actual XAML is pretty simple. It's got a couple of binding properties and so forth. So these properties that you're seeing here are actually coming from the code behind, and specifically from the data context, which is being injected through MEF through this import by a component that supports the DockShell contextual container control view model. That was hard to say. And if we go back to our view models for a second, and we look at our contextual container view model here, and double click that, you'll see that this exports that specific interface. So that's how MEF knows that this is the view model that it needs to instantiate when it instantiates that particular control. And you'll see here that within that particular view model, we do have this very unique behavior that is very unique to the contextual control itself. And contextual controls for Telerik versus another third-party control are implemented completely differently. And some are radically differently. And so this interface that's here, basically the implementation details that's inside this particular interface are going to be quite different from one vendor to the next. Fortunately, we'll do most of the work for you, but you still have the flexibility of A, understanding what's there, and B, the flexibility of making any changes to your particular underlying controls. So there you go. That pretty much describes the what a DockShell provider project does and looks like. And the last thing that we wanted to discuss is that when you actually download your specific provider project, and you want to actually bring it into your LightSwitch application, you have to build it first. And the one thing that you're going to be missing are the third-party controls themselves. We do not ship those with our provider projects. That would be completely illegal. So in fact, what you'll have to do is go to the third-party control vendor's website, either purchase or use a trial version of their controls. And in this case, it's Telerik, and in this case, we are looking for these very specifically named controls, the controls, docking, input, and so forth. Telerik's themes are actually in a separate assembly, so if you wanted to change the look and feel of the entire provider project just for Telerik, you simply just have to flip this to a different theme, and that will do that for you. And then, of course, once you've done all that, you do a build, and once you've built your project, it becomes something that then you can add to your LightSwitch client projects. And that's, in fact, sort of like the closed loop nature of DockShell. By building this specific DockShell provider project, you are, in essence, bringing in the third-party controls under very specific interfaces that DockShell, the framework, knows about and the modeling tool knows about, and then you just simply wire up those elements within your model. When you save your model, it will generate a T4 template. Sorry, it will add a T4 template, which will then subsequently take your model and convert that into partial classes. Those partial classes basically are taking what you've defined in your model and pushing that into these partial classes, which at runtime gets compiled, at compile time gets compiled into your LightSwitch application, and at runtime is interpreted by the DockShell framework, so that it, once it has that information, it knows which specific control to instantiate, and again, asking MEF to do that work for it. And then once it has the actual control, which region, and this is now Prism, to inject that specific control into. So it's a fun exercise of basically wiring components together, and it really is completely endless. There is no real hard stop to what you can achieve within DockShell. You can mix and match different third-party controls within one project, provider project. You can make copies of these default controls and use them in some LightSwitch applications and not in others, and so on and so forth. Our goal is to provide a very well-tested and well thought through sort of subset of projects, provider projects, that you have the ability to kind of pick and choose and compose your own scenarios, your what we call application navigation layout scenarios, right? Which is really what it's about. And then I guess that the underlying sort of coolness to all of this is that LightSwitch is basically the LightSwitch screens themselves just become views. So they become views that are injected inside the overall story, the overall composition story at runtime. And so once you've built your provider project, that assembly is something that you'll see in subsequent videos that you would just add into your client, LightSwitch client projects as a reference. And of course, you also have to include the third-party references as well in your LightSwitch application, client application. So as you can see, we think we've got a highly extensible product that you can quite easily extend and grow as you need and tailor as you need. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this short video on configuring the DockShell provider project. Thank you.